At 1:15 hours local time, a swarm of Ukrainian AN-196 Liutyi drones was flying across the northern Caspian Sea toward Russia's Tarantul-class stealth missile corvette, Project 12418, the RFS Stupinets, along with the transport ship Port Olya-4 and the cargo ship Aster, which were suspected of carrying Iranian weapons. Although the plan had proceeded normally up to that point, everything would change within just a few seconds. What the Liutyi control systems did not know was that 3 Russian Su-35S fighter jets were conducting an air patrol mission 150 miles away. Essentially, it was a predetermined racetrack pattern in the sky where the fighters continuously flew along an oval route while waiting for trouble. Then the surveillance radar suddenly detected several signals that should not have appeared over the sea. The lead pilot immediately banked the Su-35S sharply. At this distance, they had only about 15 minutes before the UAV swarm entered an area of low clouds and denser sea clutter where radar would be almost unable to see them. The 3 Su-35S descended to an altitude of 25,000 feet. The pilots increased their throttles but did not engage the afterburners. They needed every drop of fuel for the lurking dangers that could suddenly emerge. When the distance decreased to 110 miles, the lead pilot switched the N035 Irbis-E radar from standby mode to active operation. Imagine it like driving a car and switching on the high beams. Suddenly, he was scanning the entire airspace ahead with powerful radar pulses, searching for anything that could reflect the signals back. The screen displayed nothing. A weak signal appeared for less than 2 seconds and then disappeared. Another signal flickered to the south, but it was too faint for the computer to establish a flight path. The lead pilot widened the scan area from 70 degrees to 120 degrees. Sacrificing refresh speed for broader coverage. The problem lay in physics. A high-speed fighter produces a very large Doppler effect, like emitting a warning signal, but the Liutyis were flying at only 180 miles per hour at an altitude of less than 150 feet. Their Doppler effect was almost identical to the movement of wave crests being pushed across the sea by the wind. The radar filters designed to remove sea clutter also unintentionally concealed the presence of the UAVs. To the radar, their signals blended with the movement of the waves. The tactical geometry made everything worse. Russia had positioned the Su-35S inside an air patrol box. Imagine a massive block of airspace where the fighters circled continuously, positioned to intercept any threat approaching the group of ships. But this box had been drawn for a different kind of war. It assumed that the targets would be bombers, fighters, or cruise missiles moving at high speed. It was not designed to deal with 36 small drones crawling slowly above the waves and approaching from multiple directions from an altitude of 33,000 feet. The Irbis-E radar could detect a large target at a range of hundreds of miles under favorable conditions. That sounded impressive, until you realized that small UAVs flying just above the waves were almost invisible at distances greater than 45 miles. The curvature of the Earth concealed most of the UAV's bodies. The remaining signal blended into the sea surface. At 1:19 hours local time, something flickered on the lead pilot's OLS-35 infrared search and track system. This time, it was not radar. It was heat. More than a dozen tiny warm points stood out against the cold nighttime sea surface, like seeing the glowing tips of cigarettes in the darkness. The lead pilot narrowed the field of view. The 3 Su-35S began separating from formation. The lead pilot held the central corridor. The second moved north. The third banked south to intercept the group of UAVs circling toward the corvette's flank. The distance was 40 miles and closing very quickly. The Liutyis continued flying close to the sea surface to remain hidden within the wave clutter. But in only a few seconds, the 3 Su-35S would dive directly behind them. The lead pilot pushed the control stick forward, descending to an altitude of 15,000 feet. He switched the N035 Irbis-E radar to small target tracking mode. The scan angle narrowed, the update rate increased, while the mission computer began comparing the radar data with thermal imagery from the OLS-35. He had only a few seconds before they disappeared completely. At 1:20 hours local time, the distance decreased to 36 miles. The 2 clearest tracks appeared near the center of the screen. The lead pilot switched them into track and fire mode and launched 2 R-77-1 air-to-air missiles. The first left the pylon beneath the wing. Less than 2 seconds later, the second raced away. The 2 missiles accelerated to nearly Mach 4. During the initial phase, they received correction data from the Irbis-E radar. When they were about 10 miles from their targets, the active radar seekers on the R-77-1S activated and began independently searching for the UAVs ahead. The first exploded close to a Liutyi, tearing apart its wing and engine and sending it crashing into the Caspian Sea. The second detonated slightly too early. Fragments damaged the tail section of another UAV, but its autopilot still maintained its course. It slowed down and began swaying violently, but continued its mission. The third Su-35S continued closing in. It pulled out of its dive at an altitude of 11,000 feet and brought a group of UAVs into its gun sight. The cannon reticle on the head-up display continuously jumped between three targets. One disappeared behind the thermal clutter from the sea surface. The second moved out of the line of sight. The third maintained its course for less than 2 more seconds. That was enough. The pilot pulled the trigger. The J-301 cannon fired a short burst. The 30mm rounds left the barrel at a rate of 1,800 rounds per minute, forming a curved stream of fire descending toward the water. Most of the rounds missed, but 2 penetrated the wing and fuselage of one Liutyi, causing it to burst into flames and tumble into the water. That was the second UAV destroyed. But the remaining drones did not allow the Su-35S to make another firing pass. At 1:21 hours local time, the entire UAV swarm immediately split formation. One group continued flying straight ahead. One group turned north. The remaining group moved south, heading toward the flank of the RFS Stupinets missile corvette. From the Russian pilot's perspective, the scene looked like coins falling into murky water. At one moment, the radar displayed clear signals. At another, the Irbis-E screen was filled only with sea clutter. They had become multiple small groups of targets approaching from different directions, forcing the 3 Su-35S to divide their attention just before the next defensive layer began firing. The 3 groups of Liutyis continued increasing the distance between them, with each group heading toward a different ship. There was no longer enough time to continue searching by radar, so the lead pilot switched entirely to the OLS-35 infrared system. The electro-optical sensor began tracking the small heat signatures produced by the UAV's piston engines close to the sea surface. At 1:22 hours local time, a heat signature appeared about 9 miles to the north. The second Su-35S descended to an altitude of 9,000 feet and locked onto the target with the infrared seeker of an R-73 missile. The pilot fired. The missile left the launch rail, accelerated to more than Mach 2, and raced downward toward the sea surface. But the Liutyi continuously changed altitude with the waves below. At times, the target appeared clearly in front of the seeker. Only 1 second later, the heat signature blended into the reflections on the water. The R-73 could not maintain a stable lock. The missile passed behind the UAV and then plunged into the Caspian Sea. The 3 Su-35S continued descending to obtain a better viewing angle, but the denser air near the water caused their AL-41F1S engines to consume fuel faster than expected. Every minute of pursuit was now reducing the amount of fuel needed to return to base. Meanwhile, the Liutyi, whose tail had been damaged by fragments from the R-77 one, began losing control. It descended from an altitude of 100 feet to less than 30 feet, banked sharply to one side, and then struck the crest of a wave. The UAV broke apart on the sea surface. It was the third Liutyi removed from the formation. At 1:26 hours local time, ground control ordered the interception to end. The 3 Su-35S climbed, left the pursuit area, and returned to base with their remaining fuel. After nearly 6 minutes of engagement, 3 Liutyi UAVs had been eliminated, but 33 others continued advancing toward the group of ships. The Russian Su-35S fighters had been forced to leave the battle, and now responsibility for stopping the entire UAV swarm passed to the final defensive layer on the sea. 43 miles from the group of ships toward the coastline, an S-400 battalion received target data from the 3 Su-35S. The 91N6E surveillance radar immediately turned toward the northern Caspian Sea and switched from wide-area scanning to focused search mode. Imagine a rotating lighthouse suddenly concentrating all of its light on a single area. That was what the 91N6E radar was doing with radio waves. In theory, it could detect fighter aircraft at a distance of 250 miles. But these were not fighter aircraft. These were 33 small Liutyis with radar cross-sections no larger than those of large seagulls, flying close to the sea surface and dispersing in 3 different directions. At 1:28 hours local time, the first signals appeared on the screen: 15 targets, then 10. After the next sweep, the number increased to 20, before dropping to 8. The 92N6E fire control radar attempted to separate each signal into an individual flight track, but the UAVs continuously appeared, disappeared, and then blended into the sea clutter. It was like trying to track surfers on the surface of the sea. They continuously rose, dipped, and seemed to disappear behind each wave. Data from the Su-35S indicated that there were 33 UAVs, but the S-400 system never saw all of them at the same time, and the battalion commander had to make a choice: launch the missiles while the data was still unstable, or wait for the UAVs to come closer so the radar could obtain clear tracks. But every second of waiting brought them nearly 300 feet closer to the group of ships. 48 48N6DM missiles had been prepared on the launchers. The combat computer began ranking the targets according to signal strength, direction of approach, and distance from the RFS Stupinets missile corvette. The 4 strongest tracks were marked in red. 1 was in the central corridor, 2 were circling south. The last was leading the UAV group advancing toward Port Olya-4. At 0129 hours local time, the 92N6E radar finally established 4 tracks stable enough to engage, but the interception window was less than 2 minutes. After that, the entire UAV swarm would descend below the radar horizon and disappear once again. Less than 2 minutes to track, identify, and destroy 33 targets, dispersed across an area dozens of miles wide. The S-400 battalion commander now faced an almost impossible choice. Each 48N6DM missile cost $1.5 million, while a Liutyi cost only a small fraction of that amount. If he fired at every signal appearing on the screen, the missile stockpile could quickly be depleted merely chasing tracks that did not exist. But if he waited for perfect data, the UAV swarm would descend below the radar horizon before the S-400 could fire. That was the brutal calculation of modern warfare. Sometimes a cheaper weapon did not need to penetrate an air defense system. It only needed to force that system to waste ammunition. At 1:30 hours local time, the 4 leading targets entered a range of about 41 miles. The 92N6E radar could maintain stable tracks for only a few seconds. The commander authorized fire. The first 2 48N6DM missiles left their launchers less than 2 seconds apart. 4 seconds later, the second salvo was launched. 4 columns of fire rose along the Caspian coastline, illuminating the entire position. The missiles accelerated to more than Mach 6, climbing before pitching down toward the sea surface. From above, the Liutyis should have stood out more clearly against the water. During the initial phase, the missiles flew under inertial guidance and received correction commands from the 92N6E radar. As they approached their targets, the radar had to continue illuminating each UAV so the semi-active seeker could maintain its track. But each Liutyi produced only an extremely small signal. The radar was trying to find an object with a radar cross-section no larger than that of a large bird amid dozens of square miles of moving sea surface. In theory, it could be done, but it had to know exactly where to look. The first 2 missiles maintained their tracks on Liutyis at the edge of the formation where the signals were less obscured. The first missile began its dive. 8 seconds to the target, 5 seconds, then 2 seconds. The proximity fuse activated. Directly above the Liutyi, the fragmentation warhead tore through the wing and engine compartment. The UAV banked sharply, lost altitude, and crashed into the Caspian Sea. The second missile tracked a Liutyi, leading the group flying toward Port Olya-4. The target descended close to the wavetops, but the radar maintained the signal for several more seconds. The 48N6DM exploded behind the UAV. Fragments tore away the tail section. The Liutyi spun and fell into the water. 2 missiles, 2 targets destroyed. But the second salvo was not as fortunate. As the third missile descended, 3 Liutyis ahead suddenly closed the distance between them. On the radar screen, the 3 signals merged into one large track and then immediately separated. The fire control computer could not determine the original target. The track jumped from one UAV to another and then disappeared. The missile continued toward the last predicted coordinates, but the swarm had split in 3 directions. None of the targets remained inside the lethal radius. The missile passed over the sea surface and then self-destructed. The final missile detected a track with a speed and altitude similar to those of a Liutyi. The signal appeared during 2 consecutive scans, enough for the system to confirm a target. The missile changed direction and dived, but the track continued fluctuating. For 1 second, it was 100 feet above the sea surface. On the next scan, its altitude fell to almost 0. It could have been sea foam, a group of waves reflecting simultaneously, or the signal of a Liutyi blending into the sea clutter. The 48N6DM exploded at the predicted coordinates. A large column of water rose from the Caspian Sea, but the radar recorded no destroyed target. 4 missiles had been launched. 2 Liutyis were destroyed. The other 2 missiles achieved no result. At 1:32 hours local time, the 31 surviving UAVs continued descending and spreading out. The number of tracks on the 92N6E screen fell from 16 to 9, then to only 4 unstable, flickering signals. The S-400 battalion still had missiles remaining, but the commander did not authorize another launch. At this range, every additional shot risked wasting a 48N6DM on sea clutter or an unconfirmed track. Russia's long-range defensive layer stopped firing, but the remaining targets were now flying too low, too slowly, and too widely dispersed. They were entering an area where long-range missiles were no longer the appropriate weapon, and the defense now depended solely on the RFS Stupinets missile corvette itself. Immediately, the RFS Stupinets' final defensive line used everything it had. At 1:33 a.m., the positive ME 1.2 radar aboard the RFS Stupinets received a warning from the S-400 battalion. The most dangerous group was heading directly toward the missile corvette. The captain immediately ordered the RFS Stupinets to accelerate, break away from the formation, and position itself in front of the Port Olya-4 and the cargo ship Aster. The ship turned its bow toward the UAV swarm, placing the AK-176MA gun in a favorable firing position. At 1:34 a.m., 8 UAVs approached from the front at a distance of 12 miles. The AK-176MA immediately opened fire first. The 76.2mm shells exploded in front of the formation, creating fragmentation zones above the sea. After several bursts, 2 Liutyis were destroyed, but the remaining UAVs quickly spread out, circled around both sides of the ship, and passed through the first layer of fire. The distance was now less than 4 miles. The 2 AK-630M systems immediately joined the battle. Streams of 30mm rounds swept across the sea surface, destroying 3 more UAVs approaching from the front, the south, and the rear of the ship. 5 Liutyis had been destroyed, but 26 continued advancing. Some headed toward the RFS Stupinets, while others circled around the corvette toward the 2 cargo ships. The Russian captain activated the PK-10 system. Decoy rounds exploded around the formation, creating multiple false radar signals and heat sources. On the UAV swarm's sensor screens, the 3 ships immediately became multiple overlapping targets. The Liutyis now had to determine which were decoys and which were the real ships. But it did not stop there. At 1:36 a.m., the distance decreased to less than 8 miles. The TK-25E electronic warfare system aboard the RFS Stupinets was activated. At the same time, the electronic warning receivers began scanning the frequency bands around the group of ships, searching for the UAV swarm's communication, control, and navigation signals. Only a few seconds later, the system detected multiple weak signals moving in alignment with the tracks on the positive ME 1.2 radar. The combat computer immediately matched them. 1 radio signal, 1 radar track, 1 target. The TK-25E antennas turned toward the 3 groups of UAVs and transmitted interference into narrow sectors. Instead of covering the entire sea surface, they concentrated energy directly on the approaching targets. That was what the RFS Stupinets was doing to the Liutyi swarm's navigation systems, and something strange began happening almost immediately. The satellite receivers aboard the UAVs still reported strong signals. They were still tracking multiple satellites and still generating coordinates, but those coordinates began to lie. 1 second, the lead Liutyi was flying above the sea. The next, the system believed it had drifted nearly half a mile to the east. Then its position jumped backward. After that, the computer showed the UAV as being almost inside the Russian ship formation. The autopilot immediately attempted to correct the error, but the data kept changing, causing the control surfaces to adjust in 2 opposing directions, and the UAV began to sway. The others experienced similar problems. 1 turned too far north, 2 others closed the distance between them until their flight paths nearly intersected. Some UAVs were forced to slow down to determine their positions again. On the positive ME 1.2 screen, the tracks began moving chaotically, drifting off course, turning back, then separating again. But the TK-25E could not deceive the entire UAV swarm. In less than 2 seconds, most of the navigation computers recognized that the satellite coordinates were changing faster than the UAVs could physically move. They marked the signals as unreliable and switched to inertial navigation. From that moment, each UAV used its gyroscopes, accelerometer, speed, and direction of flight to calculate its own position. That method was accurate enough for a short period, but errors would gradually accumulate. Even a small deviation could cause a UAV to miss its target by hundreds of feet after several minutes, and 2 Liutyis failed to switch to backup mode in time. The first received 3 false coordinates in succession. The autopilot attempted to return to the original flight path, causing it to bank nearly 40 degrees while flying less than 80 feet above the sea surface. Its right wing struck the crest of a wave. The UAV rolled sideways, broke apart, and disappeared from the radar. The second simultaneously lost its positioning data and its ability to maintain altitude, descending to 25 feet. The autopilot attempted to pull the nose upward, but it was already too late. The engine section struck the water first, pulling the entire UAV into the Caspian Sea. 2 more targets were removed from the mission, but 24 Lutyis continued flying. Their formation had been disrupted. The distances between them kept changing, and some had drifted away from their original approach corridors. However, their inertial navigation systems continued guiding them toward the target area. The TK-25E had disrupted the formation. It had forced 2 UAVs into the sea, but it could not make the entire Liutyi swarm turn back. At 1:37 a.m., the remaining 24 targets continued penetrating the jamming screen and the clouds of PK-10 decoys surrounding the group of ships. They no longer knew exactly where they were, but they still knew that these ships were ahead. But the Ukrainian mission planners had anticipated this. They knew that GPS and data links could disappear during the final miles. Therefore, each Liutyi carried an INS, MEMS gyroscopes, an optical camera, and reference images of the 3 ships. At 1:38 hours local time, the remaining 24 UAVs switched to autonomous mode. Instead of trusting the coordinates that were jumping chaotically, the cameras began scanning the horizon, searching for the shapes of the Port Olya-4, the cargo ship Aster, and the RFS Stupinets positioned in front of them. The computers compared what the camera saw with the preloaded images. The INS might have accumulated errors, but once the outline of a ship was recognized, the UAV once again knew which direction the target was located. This method was crude, but at a distance of only a few miles, it was enough. 10 Liutyis headed toward the RFS Stupinets. 8 continued advancing toward the Port Olya-4. The remaining 6 circled toward the Aster. However, smoke from the gunfire, columns of water rising from the sea, and the PK-10 decoys continuously obscured the targets. Some UAVs lost identification and had to search again or switch back and forth between multiple signals. Meanwhile, the RFS Stupinets continued firing. The AK-176MA engaged targets at longer range. The 2 AK-630M systems protected the close range, while the PK-10 continued creating additional false signals around the group of ships. The Liutyis no longer had GPS. They no longer had links to their operators, but their cameras had seen the ships. From that moment on, jamming was no longer enough. Russia had to destroy each UAV before it could independently lock onto its final target. At 01:39 hours local time, the 3 groups of Liutyis dived simultaneously. 10 headed toward the RFS Stupinets. 8 targeted the transport ship Port Olya-4. The remaining 6 circled toward the cargo ship Aster. The Russian group of ships continued firing. The AK-176MA gun intercepted targets at long range, while the 2 AK-630M guns created walls of fire just above the sea surface. Clouds of PK-10 decoys still surrounded the formation, causing the UAV cameras to switch constantly between real targets and false signals. But the distance was now less than 2 miles. The lead Liutyi flew through a column of water created by artillery fire. The camera lost its image for less than 1 second, then locked again onto the low, angular superstructure of the RFS Stupinets. Although the INS had accumulated errors because of the jamming, the shape of the ship was still clear enough for the computer to correct the final flight path. The AK-630M opened fire. The first UAV broke apart. The second lost part of its wing and fell into the sea. But the UAVs behind them had spread out, forcing the 2 guns to switch targets constantly. A few seconds later, 1 Liutyi passed through the defensive fire and struck the upper section of the corvette. The explosion damaged several antennas, sensors, and light structures on the deck. Another struck near the stern, causing a small fire before the damage control team extinguished it. The RFS Stupinets had been damaged, but its engines and steering system were still operating. The ship continued turning, maintaining its position between the UAV swarm and the 2 cargo ships behind it. At the same time, 8 Liutyis approached the Port Olya-4 from the port side. Some were shot down by the guns aboard the corvette, but the remaining UAVs had already come too close. 1 UAV dived onto the cargo deck, damaging loading equipment and setting nearby materials on fire. The next struck the rear section, damaging the electrical system and auxiliary pipelines. The Port Olya-4 did not sink, but thick smoke, fire, and the risk of the flames spreading into the cargo hold forced the crew to slow down and then stop completely. On the opposite side of the formation, 6 Liutyis were heading toward the Aster. Gunsmoke and PK-10 decoys caused 3 UAVs to lose their locks. One flew off course past the bow of the ship. Another plunged into the sea after making multiple course corrections, but one UAV maintained its image of the target. It struck the rear deck, causing an explosion and a localized fire near the cargo area. The firefighting system was activated almost immediately, helping the crew isolate the damaged section and prevent the flames from spreading deeper into the hull. The Aster remained afloat. The fire was brought under control, but the ship was forced to leave the formation to inspect the damage. In this fictional scenario, Russian air defenses stopped most of the threat, but the pressure from the UAV swarm was still great enough for some of them to break through and cause damage. All events, forces, and results in the video are hypothetical scenarios created for illustrative and entertainment purposes. Because in the end, true victory does not lie in the number of weapons that manage to penetrate the defensive line. It lies in the day when those weapons no longer have to be used. If you believe that peace is always the ultimate objective, comment "I choose peace" and subscribe to the channel to continue. Following the next analysis.